What I think Trump is engaged in is not so much a victory as a sort of acting out a kind of major self-defeat for himself and the United States of America. For example, the tariff situation that doesn't portend well for the global economy, and if that happens, then it's not going to portend well for the United States itself either.
Welcome to Thinkers, the show on Times Radio, where we try and explore some of the big issues with some of the brightest minds of the time. Today, here's a topic for you to wrestle with, to get your heart racing. Culture wars, the growing anxiety around speaking freely. How important is freedom of expression? How absolute is freedom of expression? How confected are the rows around it, if at all? Is intellectual discourse at its heart under threat? How do we actually just say what we think? How important is saying what we think? All sorts of questions we'll try and get into today with Professor C Grayling, the philosopher, public intellectual and author of a book called Discriminations, Making Peace in the Culture Wars. He joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Stig.
Let's start. What is a culture war then, Professor Grayling? Let's define our terms.
In the most general sense, it's the kind of disagreement that any society has with itself about how it's going to conduct itself, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, how people are going to get along together if they are. And it takes many different forms, and it's a constant, really, in history. Because after all, any society is a continuous negotiation with itself about these matters. And what we're witnessing at the moment when we talk about the culture wars, sometimes also we say the woke wars, we're talking about how society currently going through a major transition, really, in the relationships within all the diverse groups that there are in society, how that's going to work out. And on the extremes, both on both sides of this debate or this clash, things are said and things are done that really offend people on the other side. And the rhetorical hysteria that sometimes arises out of it is much promoted by the advent of social media, which has thrown a lot of petrol on these flames and made things seem a great deal worse, perhaps, than they are.
And so is it healthy? I mean, because you talk about that, because maybe the metaphor of the pendulum is interesting, that what strikes me about culture wars or wars about identities, it's probably about identity to a certain extent, isn't it? That they tend to go in one direction, which might be very much on one side of the argument, and then come back the other way. We've seen that, I think, with the trans debate. We've seen it maybe even with questions of racial identity, where there's maybe a very liberal view starts becoming to be expressed, which is itself a reaction against a very conservative past, and then that liberal view maybe goes too far, and then it gets pulled back again into the discourse. So is this actually quite a healthy thing, that it's a constantly moving to and fro?
Well, it can be a healthy thing, but it can also be an unhealthy thing when matters overshoot somewhat. But it's certainly true that this continual negotiation that a society has with itself does indeed involve the swinging of the pendulum, and it does mean that a society will veer from being more liberal to being more conservative, and sometimes there will be extremes. So if you go back in history, for example, and think of the Puritan moment in 17th century British history, when a single generation after the age of Shakespeare, the theatres of the country were shut down. I mean, that does seem to be rather an extreme reaction, and had it endured, it would have resulted in the loss of a major advantage to world civilization, not just to our own. I mean, that's just one of many examples. The pendulum goes backwards and forwards, and the effort should be to try to superinduce a degree of calmness and rationality by identifying what's really key in the debate. And one thing in the current debate is that one has to get away from identity politics and recognize that what's really at issue underlying it all is the rights, the human rights of individuals. If individual rights were recognized and respected, none of these problems would arise. There wouldn't be discrimination, because after all, today's culture wars are fundamentally about discrimination, about preventing people from gaining access to a fair place in society, a fair slice of the cake, an opportunity to, be on equal terms with everybody else. And most of the people who have been fighting against discrimination, so we're thinking here about racism, sexism, homophobia, ageism, disableism, attitudes towards people who feel uncomfortable with the gender that they have been assigned or adopted. I mean, all the different kinds of discriminations against such people are against people who, until very, very recently indeed, didn't even have the right to claim their human rights, to claim their fair place in society. It's only really since the second half of the 20th century that this has happened. And what we're seeing today in the culture wars, the woke wars, is just another chapter in that great endeavor that began, we could say, back in the 60s with the civil rights movement, with second wave feminism. And by the way, these movements have made great advances. They've really improved matters greatly for women, for people of color, for gay people. And those very advances, of course, have annoyed the people who don't like those advances and who are therefore now pushing back in a very major way, as we see in Mr. Trump's America.
Well, let's talk about that, because so before we get to Trump, because I think that's an interesting one to use as an example. So woke, in your mind, is actually a good thing. The awakening of the end of the 20th century is a good thing.
Yes, it is. The word woke, of course, has now been captured by the right, by the conservative wing of in this argument, and demonized. It's been turned into a pejorative term, a term of vituperation and ridicule and attack. But it has a noble ancestry. I mean, after all, it comes from the African American experience of encouraging, members of that community to be alert to the fact. I mean, they were plenty alert to the fact that they were discriminated against big time, by slavery and Jim Crow laws and so on. But to be alert to all the subtler and sometimes hidden ways in which racism expresses itself. So when a person went to get a job or rent a flat or open a bank account or try to get the kids in school, they might meet people who, smile and seem friendly, but who act in ways that actually disadvantage them. So to be awake to that was a good call. And out of the way that African Americans expressed it, to be woke, to be alert to discrimination in society, and even indeed in one's own attitudes and responses, is a very good thing in trying to readjust the world to be a more fair and more just place.
So what went wrong?
Well, it's not so much that things have gone wrong. As I said a moment ago, the great endeavor for the rights of individuals to be respected, which, as I say, really took off in the second half of the 20th century, it has annoyed those people who feel that their interests, now note that word, interests rather than rights, that their interests are threatened by according rights to other people. But if you're a member of a relatively privileged and well-off community within which people scratch one another's backs and help one another, have access to, the high-end version of the goods that society offers, health, education, opportunity, that kind of thing, and you don't want to let other people into the club, then you're tempted to push back against the claim that people make when they come knocking at the door.
But that implies, I think, Professor Grayling, that what they're asking is always proportionate. And I think one danger in this debate is that no one would argue for equal rights, for rights accorded to people in a just and fair way. But sometimes rights come into conflict with someone else's rights. For example, a trans woman who wants to go to a woman's toilet or participate in a woman's space, in a sport. There are two rights in conflict there, and you have to select which one. And I guess there's also there's a fear, perhaps the reason why culture wars have become so toxic is the overreach. So instead of simply saying there should be fairness, some people believe groups have requested more than is fair in order to pay back for the centuries of unfairness. Is that fair, do you think?
Right, so you've made two interesting points there to discuss. The second point, the point about affirmative action, let's come to that in a moment. Let's go to the first point. Now, I just simply don't agree that rights ever come into conflict. I think I think regimes of rights are internally consistent. There's no problem there. What you've described in the case of the transgender issue and access to women's spaces is a conflict of interests, not of rights. I mean, interests can be legitimate. There's no question about it. And in the case where interests do come into conflict, what is required there is some intelligent way of trying to reach an accommodation which will satisfy all parties. But let me just say about the transgender issue that it tends to be focused on for the very good reason that it deals with a very, very small group of people who are particularly vulnerable or fragile in the sense that their claim on society accommodating them appears to be a rather weak one, given the assumptions that people make and the prejudices people have about traditional binaries and so on. And the anti-wokeists tend to focus on the transgender issue precisely because it is the easiest target to attack, because the kinds of things that pro-transgenderists say, the kinds of remarks that they make or phrases they use or talk about pronouns and so on, seem to be very easy to ridicule and attack. And when one reflects on that fact, one should always bear in mind that the kind of rhetoric that's being attacked there, the rhetoric involved in the transgender issues, should be compared to the kind of rhetoric used by activists and extremists on the other side of the spectrum, neo-Nazis and white supremacists and manosphere influencers and homophobes and people like that, where the rhetoric in question is disgusting. I mean, absolutely disgusting and foul in a way which is far, far more serious and objectionable than anything which is said by people on the transgender side, things like pregnant men and so on. But if you come down to the issue about women's spaces, that is a real issue. I mean, the thought that there might be women who are afraid to go out in public or to go shopping because they don't feel that they can go to a public bathroom, these raise serious issues, while on the other hand, there are people who very genuinely and very sincerely have transitioned into being of the sex that they weren't assigned to at birth. And so there really is a conflict of interests here. How to resolve it? Well, in the case of public loos, it's easy. You just make sure that all public washrooms are individual closets where no two people ever come into contact with one another. And in fact, in many societies already, including in the UK, there are now plenty of public washrooms which are exactly like that. So that removes the problem. The problem remains in women's sports, for example. And there, I think there needs to be a serious discussion. But that discussion needs to invite and involve people concerned. So women athletes and transgender athletes, these are the people who need to make the decisions and who need to dig into it.
But women athletes, I think, would say, or many women would say, Anthony, that ultimately they don't feel they should have to have these discussions. They feel that they're being erased from a space which is theirs and theirs alone. They feel that they have a fundamental right. It's not an interest question, it's a right question. They say, quite simply, as a woman, I'm entitled to only compete against biological women, because competing against people who were born biologically male is fundamentally unfair. And therefore, it's not a conflict of interest, that's a fundamental right that is being taken away from them.
Well, again, the assumptions that lie behind that remark, and I take your point, that's certainly a position that people would occupy. But the assumption there is that the biological binary is something which is fixed and very wide. And we now know from everything that medicine and genetics tells us that this is not entirely true. Think of a slightly different matter. Think about boxing, for example, where, of course, it would be very unfair if a flyweight found himself pitted against a heavyweight in the ring, because there are different physiological size, weight, and so on differences between them. Boxing has solved this problem by finding a way of categorizing participants in the sport We see, for example, in other sports like tennis, where it's quite possible that men and women might compete against one another because of the skill levels are the thing that really count.
Let's talk about the other point I raised because I think that it connects to this. The idea that in the quest to get equality, there's been overreach, affirmative action. You know, you've gone from saying everyone's sexuality should be a matter for them, perfectly logical, morally correct view, leave people alone to be who they are, to a world where you have 32 different flags for different types of sexuality, to a world in which people spend millions and millions and millions on affirmative action within government and within public services that creates a backlash, which is then articulated by Donald Trump in the White House. Is there a mistake that in the bid to fight, even in their view, on the right side of the culture war, they've actually achieved the diametric opposite of their wishes, because they've provoked the counter reaction that is actually going to harm the issue of equality because they've gone too far, they've wound people up too much, in particular 1D Trump?
Yes, well, I suppose people who are on the anti-discrimination side in all these different spheres um, have to keep their nerve and keep on keeping on against this very severe backlash which is being mounted by uh, Trump's administration. It's a tense moment in the conflicts which have arisen over these issues. But when you consider, as I say, how much success these different causes have had over the last half century and more, it's very hard to see how the genie is going to be put back in the bottle over them. And if nothing else, I think the backlash against them and the sorts of things that the Trump administration are doing really only highlights the importance of them more and invites, I think, consideration of the kind that we're trying to give it now about how we uh, ignore the extreme things that are said and done on both sides and try to really focus on the key issue, which is the issue about individual rights, not about group rights. So this speaks to your point about affirmative action and the endeavor made by, let's look at the United States of America, for example, giving opportunities to people to go into higher education whose grades might have not permitted them to do so in competition with people who were from traditionally more privileged backgrounds. Now, it seems to me that as a transition measure, as a time-limited measure, this is something which is justifiable on the grounds that by giving opportunities to people who have been denied them earlier, it really does open a path for other people. It sets a good example. It moves people from one status to another. The African American middle class has grown vastly over the last half century and so, in part helped by these measures. People who are disadvantaged by them, so for example, a young white man with better grades than a young African American man, and whose place at the university is taken by the young American man, can feel very, upset by it, regard it as a form of reverse racism, and treat it as unfair, and make the claim that meritocracy is what should rule the day. And in the larger picture, so it should. But when a society is trying to deal with itself, I mean, think about Germany after the Second World War and how it had to deal with itself and what had happened there. And so measures have to be taken. People have to come to terms, and that's why I think, as a transition measure, as a temporary measure, affirmative action can be a good thing.
Do you think Trump has won? Because the pendulum thing that we started off talking about, Trump was voted in big with a big mandate from the American people. One of the things he's against is DEI policies. He's very anti-woke, and I just wonder whether the pendulum swung so far that that's now the victory. Donald Trump controls the morality of more or less the world, certainly the Western world. He sets the template for the Western world now. Do you accept that?
Well, no, I don't. In a way, I mean, what I think Trump is engaged in is not so much a victory as a sort of acting out a kind of major self-defeat for himself and the United States of America. For example, the tariff situation that doesn't portend well for the global economy, and if that happens, then it's not going to portend well for the United States itself either. But I think Trump in this attack on DEI and on critical race theory and on all the efforts that have been made in recent years to get everybody to wake up to the fact of systematic kinds of discrimination in society, has himself poked a bear here. You talk about him having a massive mandate for the American people. Well, I don't think that the percentages of votes and what have you really bear that out. And
he's got a mandate. He had a very clear policy that was endorsed through a democratic election, which he won.
Well, again, we need to be a bit careful here. Certainly his base, certainly the sort of MAGA right, had among its concerns too much wokeism. Anti-wokeism was a driving factor for them. But there are lots of, nothing is unicausal. There are many reasons why Trump won. And among them, of course, were the perceived weakness of Biden and what had happened in Afghanistan, what was happening in Ukraine. The fact that the people in opposition to Trump were either Biden or Kamala Harris. And when it comes to picking a very old-seeming individual who's not really in control, or a woman, you've got enough ageism and sexism in the population to make them even reluctantly vote for somebody like Trump, who at least seems to be able to walk upstairs.
Yeah, although he did say he wanted to go after DEI, and he did go after DEI, and so that was his people who voted for him wanted that. And I guess the question is woke over then, do you think?
Oh, no. I don't think so, no. No, I think every defeat or every pushback that's encountered by some major social justice movement, for one thing, of course, it has a tendency to make the extremists more extreme. So, all the activists on the far wing of these movements will be provoked by it. But it would also make people rethink. I mean, just to take a parallel example, consider what's happening in the Democratic Party in the United States at the moment. They're certainly having to rethink how they articulate their policies and how they reach out to people and who they put forward and so on. They've got to reorganize a little bit. And so when you have you lose a battle, or you find yourself losing a battle, it doesn't necessarily mean losing the war. It means that you have to think better about how to fight it.
We've had a long conversation already, Anthony, about trans issues, about race, about discrimination. I feel fairly comfortable talking about these things. You evidently feel comfortable talking about them. You've written a book about the culture wars. Where's the problem here then? Are there some institutions where they just can't handle honest disagreement? There's too much bad faith in these arguments, so it sort of ruins the discourse. Where's the problem actually here then?
Well, the problem may be partially a matter of perception, or sort of partial problem, in the sense that a lot of the discussion at the opposing extremes takes place in this very shallow medium of social media, down which into the silos of which people plunge, reinforced by others who agree with them, strengthens the temptation to be emphatic and unnuanced. And of course, social media is all about very, very short messages and very unsubtle. But I think in amongst it all, that there are plenty of people thinking about these matters and thinking about how one can best move forward by identifying what's really at issue. And what I seek to argue in the book is that what's really at issue is about the rights of individual people, individual human beings. The justification for thinking in terms of human rights seems to me to be completely clear and unarguable. After all, when the idea of a regime of human rights was put forward and adopted by the United Nations back in 1948, the reasons for it, the justifications for the rights chosen, were staringly obvious in the atrocities and horrors that had been committed in the decade or so beforehand. A bit like if you take a piece of paper and you tear it in half, you can read off from the jagged edge of one half what the jagged edge of the other half is. So all you have to do is to look at the atrocities of the 1930s and 40s to see what people are justified in having just qua being human individuals.
And I guess my challenge to you, Anthony, in return, is that by coalescing that way, often the argument gets lost. So if you then have I saw the other day it was National Asexual Day, right? And no one should not have the right to be asexual if they want to not have sex with anyone. Perfectly legitimate thing to be. If you create a flag and a day and a campaign and a group, my argument, I suppose, would be that sows division. It creates a conflict where no conflict is necessary.
Well, great philosophical answer coming up here. Yes and no. I mean, it certainly can do if the purpose of creating a community of people who share interests and needs is intended to divide. But if it's intended to provide support and to raise awareness about the issues, then it's a good thing in a way, because it might make other people think and consider and act better accordingly because they're more aware. So I always think, if we come as we perhaps might in a moment to the freedom of expression matter, that it's very much better that things are expressed, even indeed, the kinds of views that people on the extreme of the conservative wing sometimes express, so that you can understand what they are, so that you can think about them, and so that you can address them properly.
That's a very, I mean, it strikes me that Donald Trump, for example, sees the world as a zero-sum equation. That if I win, you lose.
Yes.
And you strike me as someone who doesn't really accept zero-sum. You basically think that the world should be bettered by broadening out, wherefore everyone has a little bit of something rather than it's just you or me.
Yes, absolutely. You put your finger very neatly on the point there, because at the end of the book, I argue that if it were the case that everybody on the planet fully respected the rights of every other individual on the planet, so it would be a mutual respecting of rights between all people, there would simply be no discrimination. Indeed, there may very well not even be any conflict. So it's a rather utopian and idealistic view. But thinking about the possibility of it suggests something interesting, which is this. In the most extreme versions of identity politics, and let's just take as a salient example the Nazi idea of the Aryan people. There the idea is conformity and identity and unity, of bringing together very like people. They're all white, they're all Christian, they're all, well, whatever it might be. So some unifying, identifying commonality. And the great goal there is the unity of the nation, let us say. But it should not be unity, and indeed cannot be unity, because all societies are very diverse and very plural in their makeup. And so instead of seeking unity in a society, what we should be seeking is harmony. We should be seeking the possibility for people to live together and to accept that there are differences and that there is variety. And if that acceptance were possible, based on the idea of respecting others' rights, then what one would have is convivencia, a word used to describe the situation in the Iberian Peninsula in medieval times, when Jews and Muslims and Christians were able more or less to rub along together. And that should be the aim. And to achieve that aim, one has to bring the argument right down to the individual level and talk about rights and recognize that even though many interests are legitimate, it's not always the case that in a competition between interests and rights, interests should be allowed to win.
I understand. But before you go, we've been freely expressing now for half an hour. Just this question of free expression. In order to achieve this harmony, in order to have these debates, how far should we allow, take universities as a good example, free speech to flourish? So some people might come to this and say, I believe in the Aryan way of life. Someone might say, I believe that homosexuality is morally wrong. Someone might say, I believe that black people are inferior to white people. How far should they be allowed to say that in order to even be disagreed with, in order to achieve harmony? Is harmony based on people not saying the worst things, or is harmony achieved by people saying the worst things and being argued about with?
I think the latter. So the point about freedom of expression is that it is absolutely fundamental. You cannot have due process of law unless people can accuse and defend. You can't have politics unless people can put forward proposals, policies, suggestions, and have them criticized. You can't have arts and creativity worth the name if there's not freedom of expression, and so on. So it is absolutely fundamental, but it is not unqualified. That's the important point about it. Everybody knows the familiar example about shouting fire in the theatre and so on. So that means that a question arises about the responsible use of free expression. And that, of course, is a very difficult matter. And sometimes people will say, well, you're using your freedom of expression irresponsibly here by creating division and raising up anger and hostility and harming other people. And the person thus accused might say, but it's my right to say these things. So what counts as responsible use of freedom of expression has to be debated and discussed and negotiated. It has to be case by case. And you have to understand when it is appropriate, when it's a kind of intellectual good manners to use one's right to freedom of expression, where and when. So the kinds of views that you just given as examples there might be cases where somebody might put such a view, and I would rather that people were permitted to put those views so that they can be challenged, so that they can be called out, so that better arguments and better evidence and better speech can be deployed against them. But if employed in the what you might call the wrong circumstances, so for example, if a white supremacist is haranguing a mob of white supremacists and talking about people who are not white being of inferior quality or status, that is a different matter because that's incitement. And this leads us to a really important distinction here in talking about discrimination or discriminatory attitudes and speech in general. And that is that there is a kind of protective endeavor where you challenge people's malevolent use of their free speech right because they're doing harm by it. Whereas on the other hand, you might at times want to prevent irresponsible use of free speech for a greater good, as for example when you censor the press in time of war in case the enemy gets information from the newspapers.
I mean, you can sit in an ivory tower, Anthony, and bewail that, and I'm sure many will agree with you, but that's the world. We live in a world of social media, of fast, indiscriminate thought. That's reality, isn't it?
Yeah, but one doesn't just lie down on one's back and stick one's legs in the air in the face of that fact. One has to contest it. One has to push back on it. This is indeed why you're doing what you're doing at this very moment, which is having a little bit more of an extended discussion about these matters.
Well, we can keep having this conversation. I'm sure lots of people have an opinion on it, Anthony. We're not going to solve it now, but it's something we've got to keep talking about because, we all worry, don't we, about the world that we are bequeathing on. And it feels like the world is not necessarily... I mean, you make a good point, though. In fact, maybe it's an optimistic note to leave on. The world of 1945 or the world of 1965 in America was a much more overtly poor, discriminatory place. So maybe things are feeling worse but getting better. Is that a good note to leave it on?
That's a very good note to leave on, yes. I both agree with it and at the same time, if it's not a contradiction, hope that it's true.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Great to speak to you, Anthony. Lovely to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this week's episode of Thinkers here on Times Radio. Big thanks to Professor C Grayling there. Thank you so much for watching as well. Leave a comment beneath. You'll do it in a constructive way, I know. Do subscribe and tell people all about it. We'll be back with another conversation next week. Thank you very much.